with the presentation of Cory Reyburn paper. So Cory will present a paper entitled, I will give you the short version, You Did It Yourself. And yeah, the floor is all yours, Cory.
Thank you. I sent my paper in the link, so
Wonderful,
hopefully
thanks.
everyone can access it. The aim of my paper is to distinguish a bias that I believe is present with regards to empathy. So, introduction, bias in action. As a nurse starts their shift in a busy emergency room, they are given two patients, a 36-year-old male, alcohol intoxication, who just vomited on himself, and a 14-month-old baby who swallowed a button battery and is now vomiting on themselves. Both are responsible for the situation, but one is rational and the other is not. Both are sad, crying, and stressed and about having vomit all over them. If you were the nurse, for whom would you feel stronger empathy for? Having more empathy for the baby would be falling to the consequences of the you did it to yourself empathy error. The error being setting up conditions to reduce empathy towards rational agents experiencing negative consequences. The degree of committing this error depends on how much the subject perceives an agent to be a component of their consequence. Through an analysis of factors that influence empathy and various cognitive biases, we will be able to conclude that the likelihood of a subject feeling the same amount of empathy towards a human agent is decreased when the subject perceives that person had an influence on the negative event that agent finds themselves in, termed here the you did it to yourself empathy bias. For this bias to occur, two conditions must be met. The subject must believe that the agent is a rational being, per the subject's own idea of rational, and two, the subject must believe that the agent made decisions that influence their outcome. This paper will first tackle what is meant by rationality due to the definitional controversy revolving around it, as well as the priority importance in the development of this bias. With the other important term being empathy, this term, along with the factors that affect its degree of presence, will be discussed next. Then, because the proposed bias is contingent upon a subject perceiving an influence as influencing a negative event, the evaluation of standards and violations to those standards must be conducted to show that the subject perceives an agent to be a perpetrator of some standard. Showing how subjects are prone to believe other agents attribute to their situation will show that the two conditions of the bias are commonly present. With the completion of these proofs, a fully realized establishment of this proposed bias will be possible. Once established as a cognitive bias, this paper will show its applications as well as ways to overcome the you did it to yourself empathy bias. So what is meant by folk-rationality? This particular bias neither aims for nor requires an objective understanding of the term rationality, because the bias focuses on the subject's perspective. Thus, the rationality that should be considered is the view of rationality that the subject holds, a subjective folk sense of rationality. A common perception of rationality is consistency in thought and ability to derive conclusions from premises, according to Freeman. Or, more often, reasoning is said to include the ability to weigh risks and benefits and evaluate punitive consequences. That's Hawkins and Charlin. So, if a subject deems another agent as a rational being, then the subject believes this agent has the ability and thus should act on this ability. The you did it to yourself empathy bias is about a subject believing an agent is rational, so they should act responsible. Most people using folk versions of rationality would conclude that a human baby is not a rational being, nor is a person suffering from dementia, because these individuals are unable to weigh the risk and benefits or have consistency in thought and ability to derive conclusions from premises. The 36-year-old man, on the other hand, could be viewed as a rational being for either of the two ideas of rational above. Empathy and factors influencing its range. On the notion that objective rationality is inconsequential because what matters more to this bias is what the subject perceives as rational, we must evaluate if an objective version of empathy is significant for the establishment of this bias. The phenomenological interpretation of empathy will be used as an effective phenomenon, engaging our ability to share the same feeling as another. This was taken from Bloom, Prince, Hogan, Drummond, England, and Ferrarello. This phenomenological description of empathy is comprised of various subforms of empathy within, a major subform being affective or proper empathy, as defined by Hoffman as the involvement of psychological processes that make a person have feelings that are more congruent with another situation than with his own situation. The other main component of phenomenological empathy is empathetic concern, otherwise known as sympathy, in which a subject feels sorrow or concern for the distressed or needy other, treating it as something that needs to be alleviated. That's from Eisenberg and Wisp. This bias states that the subject is less likely to feel empathetic concern or the emotions of the agent to the same degree if they perceive this agent to be a rational being and a component of their negative situation, than if it were perceived that the agent had low plight responsibility or was not a rational being. To the same degree refers to empathy being able to be more than just present or absent, but rather its intensity fluctuates. From Carmessa, it can be more or less strong or more or less accurate in its understanding and feeling of another's mental states. For the bias, this idea of stronger and weaker empathy will be applied towards situational empathy, which is empathetic reactions in a specific situation, to show that a subject is likely to feel stronger empathetic concern or more accurate proper empathy towards an agent if they perceive the agent has low plight responsibility. It is acknowledged among those who study empathy that measuring this empathy is prone to error because measurements are taken by asking subjects about their experiences after exposure to a situation. By studying facial, gestural, and vocal indices of empathy-related responding, such as Zal, Valentin, or Asberg, or by various physiological measures, such as heart rate or skin conductance. Stumberg found that one. Noting that subjects are able to feel more or less of the same emotions or more or less empathetic concern for another agent, an analysis of what makes this so is important for the mechanisms behind the proposed bias. Studies suggest many factors go into determining the intensity of empathy. Factors include similarity, affective link, mood, and personality, according to Preston. The here and now bias, which is we tend to empathize more with people we perceive closer to us, according to Hoffman, or even attractiveness, which is we tend to empathize more easily with attractive people, according to Prince. Chikara describes the here and now bias in terms of in-groups and out-groups by finding that people tend to feel more empathy for their in-groups and more counter-empathy for their out-groups. Drummond lays out empathetic experience specific to humans as encountering other humans as both rational and reflective agents. Drummond continues by explaining humans are capable of and expect other humans to be capable of thinking, judging, and reflecting on choice worthiness of their own and other agents' ends. The nurse would expect the 36-year-old man to be able to think, judge, or reflect on the choice worthiness of his choice to drink too much, but this expectation would not be present for the irrational baby. Presuming, for now, that the nurse perceives the man had influence on his level of intoxication, is it likely that the nurse feels less empathetic concern and or less of the same emotions as the man than if he were vomiting due to a reason that was obviously not responsible for it? Perceptions of standards and violations. Building off the just desserts theory, we come closer to answering this question. The foundation of the just desserts theory stems from the belief that humans act as rational agents, and as such agents must consider the consequences of their actions, therefore would deserve punishment in case their acts violated justice or standard. This is Barton, Darley, Carl Smith, and Robinson. Standards are something established for use of rule or basis of comparison in measuring or judging capacity, quality, content, and value, according to Broadly. Brody continues by stating how standards can vary greatly depending on person, their resources, and the people they associate with. The just desserts theory suggests that harm targeted at an offender to a standard should be proportionate to the strength of the violation. That's von Hirsch. It is found that the more an action was judged morally wrong, the more outrage emerges, leading to stronger tendencies to punish the perpetrator. That's Fechhunger and Huang. Consequently, researchers found that the more a person had empathy for a suffering victim, the more they sought punishment for the person who caused the suffering. That's, I have trouble with this name, my apologies. Fechhunger. Further, if the bystander learns that somehow the victim did do something or instigated the perpetrator, anger might shift to the victim and empathy might increase towards the perpetrator. Hoffman. Taking the concepts of the just desserts theory and applying them to a single agent would make the agent both a perpetrator of the standard and a victim of the consequences, the person suffering and the person who caused the suffering. If taking the notions of the just desserts theory, then a violation of some standard would justify a proportionate punishment to the agent. Their plight could be thought of as a just proportionate punishment, leading to a reduction of empathy. In looking at the roles of empathy and justice on donating, researchers have found that individuals with high moral identity, which is an individual's broad associative cognitive network relating moral traits, feelings, and behaviors, according to Aquino and Reed, they had increased empathy for charity recipients with low perceived responsibility, but not for recipients with high perceived responsibility. The researchers concluded that consideration of high recipient responsibility raises justice concerns, suppressing feelings of empathy that might otherwise motivate charitable donations. That was Lee et al. Hoffman illuminates this conclusion that if, I said that wrong. Hoffman illuminates this by concluding that if it is believed that a victim does not deserve the suffering, empathy might increase. But if it is believed that the victim is not a good person and deserves the suffering, the observer may not feel empathy towards the victim. This research, as well as the just desserts theory, shows that if a subject believes the agent made decisions that influence their situation, they would be less likely to feel the same degree of phenomenological empathy as the agent than if the agent perceived them to have low plight responsibility. Since the standards in which the agent is judged in terms of eliciting empathy or not is up to the subjective bystander, it matters whether the agent violates the subject's perception of standards to determine if the subject will elicit empathy towards the agent. The established cognitive bias, curse of knowledge, plays an influential role here because the subject, by holding the agent to their standards, is under the presumption that the agent has the same level of knowledge the subject has. The curse of knowledge bias shows that once a subject knows something, it is difficult for them to imagine anyone else does not also know it, making it difficult to think about the problems from the perspective of the lesser informed person. That was Newton. With those with a specific knowledge in some standard are more susceptible to perceive an agent to violate that standard than those without that knowledge. Therefore, as aforementioned, if a subject perceives an agent violated some standard, then the subject would perceive the agent to be a component of their negative situation and would deem some level of punishment appropriate, causing the likelihood of the subject feeling empathy towards the agent to decrease. Biases affecting perceptional attribution. The last component to actualize the you did it to yourself empathy bias would be to show that the subject is predisposed to believing the second of the two conditions of the bias. The subject must believe that the agent made decisions to influence their outcome. Humans, having the ability to think, judge, and reflect on choice worthiness, as mentioned by Drummond, have the tendency to attribute this ability as opposed to situational factors to explain human behavior, leading to a tendency to victim blame. The fundamental attribution bias in conjunction with the correspondence bias describes a perceiver's tendency to underestimate the impact of situational factors on human behavior and to overestimate the impact of dispositional factors. That's by Ross. The dispositional factors being inferred stable personality traits. That's Galgronsky. The actor-observer bias states that a subject will tend to believe that other agents are responsible for the behaviors they exhibit and that situations are responsible for the behaviors that the subject exhibits. The combination of these biases cause people to place too much weight on a person and not enough on the situation, leading to people making attributions of blame towards others, even victims, for their behavior. That was Jahinari and Terry. Another bias, the just world hypothesis, describes the tendency for an individual to make attributions based on believing the world is fundamentally just, by the same authors. When people are in difficult situations, the just world hypothesis can cause perceivers to make internal attributions about the cause of the situation and end up blaming an agent for their problems, Rubin and Palu. The combination of these biases show that the nurse, being human, has the tendency to believe that the man's drinking behavior caused him to vomit on himself and is a fair outcome for his behavior. Studies suggest some reasons that make a perceiver have the tendency to attribute others to be the causative factor for the situation are that it makes the perceiver boost their self-esteem and believe that they have a desired personal image in social life. Showcasing a tendency to view others in negative light so that we can feel superior by contrast. This is termed downward social comparison. This comparison gives rise to illusion comparison control, which is a tendency for people to believe that they're better able than others to control outcomes. That's Shepard, Fox, Engel, Gate, and Johnson. Regardless, the nurse is prone to believe that the man had influence on the negative event he finds himself in. Actualization of the bias. Identifying that empathy has degrees, that subjects are prone to have less empathy towards a perpetrator of some standard, and that humans have a tendency to perceive other agents as being components of their negative outcome, aka perpetrators, suggests a tendency to reduce empathy towards these same agents. Given this analysis, the bias is fully realized. Humans are prone to perceive rational agents as a component of their plight, reducing empathy towards these agents. The more an individual perceives an agent to be a component of their outcome, the more they are at risk to perceive this agent to be a perpetrator of some standard, and the more they are at risk for a reduction of empathy. Understanding the bias exists and the tendencies that make up its mechanisms of the bias now presents us with the opportunity to come to terms with the pros and cons of the bias. The bias gives rise to a tendency for a subject to be more selective with their empathy. This tendency would protect the subject from empathetic over-arousal, which is when a subject is so emotionally overwhelmed by their empathetic feelings that they're unable to be concerned with the suffering of another. That's Hoffman. Beyond this, Kilmecki and Singer describe empathetic distress fatigue, colloquially known as compassion fatigue, to be a form of pathological altruism that arises from the experience of negative emotions, which leads to a self-oriented response with a desire to alleviate one's own distress. They report that this distress has detrimental consequences for the mental and physical health of the affected person. The you did it to yourself empathy bias can be presumed to be a psychological safeguard to this pathological distress. The main con to the bias is obviously the anti-caring effects brought on by the bias, showcasing its relevance in fields that revolve around caring, such as healthcare, applications, and overcoming. With empathy being one of the components that drive pro-social behavior, compassion, in various authors have said that. It becomes an important component in areas where pro-social behavior is deemed necessary. Pro-social behavior is of major importance to nursing due to nursing have a core ethical principle of benevolence, which is duty to care for and about the patients. That's Halgad and Gallagher. As healthcare professionals are at risk for the curse of knowledge bias, Newton and Lett, they are also at risk for the you did it to yourself empathy bias because healthcare workers' knowledge about disease processes, more specifically the risk factors for disease processes, lead them to the mentality that the suffering individual committed a risk factor, violated a standard, thus lining them up for the you did it to yourself thought. Understanding this makes it important to recognize ways to diminish the bias, especially in areas where pro-social behavior is necessary. One of the most established ways for putting out this bias is perspective taking. Actively trying to take the perspective of another agent would combat the curse of knowledge bias by allowing the subject to realize that the other agent may not know the risks and benefits and morals of their behavior. That's Darmot. A study exploring the role of rationality in influencing sentencing showed that participants who scored higher on perspective-taking scale were more likely to find the agent not guilty, Hurst and Foley. In theory, the more similar a person is to the perpetrator, the more empathy felt, the more lenient in assigning blame and responsibility, Davis, Bray, and Holt. Furthermore, Peterson and Silver found that subjects who read more detailed background information on a perpetrator reported more empathy for them than those who only read basic background information. Recognizing another's perspective by gathering more background information has been shown to enhance empathy. Besides the direct perspective of the perpetrator, Lee et al. Found that empathy was evoked for recipients who were perceived responsible for their own plight by making the donor's immorality salient. The simplest way to avoid the you did it to yourself empathy error is by realizing the bias exists, by accepting being prone to the bias, and by being optimistic that we can overcome it. That was Doty and Carol. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cory, for this great presentation. And the note, I didn't mention, but they are not all philosophy major students. I mean, you're from the nursing department, so it's quite challenging to be able to look at this phenomenon from a philosophical perspective when fairly new to philosophy. So, chapeau.
This is my first semester actually taking philosophy classes. That's true.
So I wanted to say that. All right, so the floor is open for questions. I set the timer.
Besides the healthcare field, because you said healthcare workers are more prone to this bias because of their knowledge of, you know, different diseases and how people get them and stuff, like alcoholism.
Right.
What other profession, do you think there are other professions that are more prone to this kind of bias besides healthcare workers?
I do believe that there could be other professions more prone to this bias than the average profession, but being that I am a nursing student and having worked in the healthcare field, that is the field that I'm most comfortable saying this bias exists in. I could imagine it to exist in other professions such as first responders or
I was just gonna say law
firefighting. Yeah, law enforcement. There you go. That's a good one. Firefighting, such as some person is inhaled a whole bunch of smoke and is coughing, but then it was found that they were standing up in the building rather than getting close to the floor, which, if you're unaware of the curse of knowledge, with a fire, smoke inhalation is one of the worst things that could happen. And so you're supposed to get down below the smoke as opposed to standing and being in the smoke. So I can imagine something like that.
We have space for one more question, or even two. Juan, please.
Would you say that having, I would say, like empathy in the healthcare kind of workplace would be a detriment? Because if you cared for everyone, you would kind of feel the loss a little bit more. So maybe having a little less empathy would probably be a thing to consider, or well, what's your opinion?
Yeah, so a couple of authors that I've found when I was doing this research really wanted to put the emphasis on empathy being able to distinguish yourself from the other agent, meaning the subject distinguishes themselves from the agent they're feeling empathy for. And that was a big component of this whole phenomenon of it being psychologically and physiologically taxing on the body, because there were different studies that showed having empathy could actually induce the same regions of the brain as having your own pain or having your own distress. And so it's that buildup of having too much and it ongoing that could lead to that compassion fatigue or empathetic distress fatigue, which honestly is probably a more appropriate term. And so just as the safeguard for the empathetic over-arousal, yes, it may be of benefit for areas in healthcare where you are dealing with death or dealing with building a emotion with the patient, such as in the ICU. Some of those patients are in there for months, and you build an emotion with them or build a connection with them, and then they pass away. And if you are unable to go and do your job the next day, or if you are so hurt that you can't build a connection with another patient, that seems to be a problem. So yes, this could be a safeguard to stuff like that. But yet I would want to research further into it.
Do we have one last question? All right, so congratulations again for your flawless presentation, Cory. And now we give the word to Professor Nirenberg. Thank you so much.
Thank you.